Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is US elections as special with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. We are going to look at a number of different topics before the elections start tomorrow. Goodness me, I'm genuinely excited. I think I'm more excited about this election than I've been about any British election that's ever taken place. Because it's so freaking important. It really, really is. And it will have reverberations around the world. And I just hope the right decisions are made by many, many people across the nation. Okay, we are going to talk about economics to begin with. Now, JP Morgan Chase, a bank, has estimated that a tariff hike half the size of the one Mr. Trump is advocating would knock a third to half a percentage point off GDP growth in its first year and increase inflation by 1.5 to 2 percentage points. Now, I think it's been absolutely staggering that people think Trump is good on the economy when he clearly has shown himself to be ignorant, like genuinely ignorant about macroeconomic matters. He is a transactional businessman, but he doesn't understand how economics works. We saw that at the Economic Club of New York, at the Economic Club of Chicago, where he gave supposedly economic speeches that were rambling messes, and when he was questioned on particular topics, and when the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg was pressing him on economic matters, he showed he didn't understand how things worked, particularly tariffs. And he has said publicly on True Social that tariffs are not a sales tax, that they are a tax on the countries in question whose goods are being taxed as they come into the country. But that's not the case. He doesn't understand that you put the tariff on to the goods being imported, and so basically the importers will have to pay extra money, and they either sink that, in which case they don't make as much profits, or they pass that on to the consumer, and they are themselves, of course, a consumer. So that inflation invariably, or that tariff is invariably passed on as inflation. So it will have an inflationary effect, especially since these are not strategic tariffs. I don't have a problem with tariffs. Tariffs are a great tool to use as a government if you want to do infant industry protectionism. If you want to say, this is how the UK did so well in the Industrial Revolution, is we looked at textile industries, we wanted to protect our own as it was nascent, and we were trying to stop, as in the kind of industrialization of that domain was nascent, and we wanted to protect that, so we put tariffs on textiles as they came in from, say, India, a place that we already had a great deal of it was like part of our imperial economic outlook, I would say. So go and stick a flag in countries and then tax their goods as we import them. But the idea, essentially, we were wanting to protect a particular industry. So strategic tariffs have a place in your economic toolbox. Across the board tariffs, which is what Trump has said, are ridiculous. They have no place in any sensible economist's toolbox. If you're going to put across the board tariffs of, as quote 100, 200, 400, 500, 2,000%. So he's quoted all of those and says, hey, I don't care. There's not just a lack of detail, there's a disregard for understanding and for nuance and for knowledge and for policy. There's just a massive disregard for saying anything thoughtfully. And so he's just like, I don't really care, just tariffs across the board, because it gets a cheer, because everyone thinks in their minds of the low information electorate, I'm talking about economically speaking there, in their minds it's like, let's screw China. And this is your proxy for let's screw China. Screw China, we're going to tariff all of their goods. We're going to put tariffs on all of their goods. And of course, that's just massively inflationary, especially, that can be end products or components. So components to make the things, or end products from China, are now all the more expensive. Now, you could argue eventually down the line, it would promote your own industry to build alternatives to that. But if you're putting across the board tariffs, that's a straight away inflationary pressure, because you don't have time for your own peeps to react to that and to build. And that assumes that they would be able to undercut the prices of those Chinese goods anyway. So it's just thoroughly problematic. And of course, economists know this. There is no coincidence that most economists are supporting Harris's campaign and agenda. That includes Nobel Prize winning economists. I think it's 100 economists, was it, that wrote a letter? It's just, it's incredible. So JP Morgan, what is driving Harris's nascent outperformance? It is primarily women and older votes. Harris is winning female independents by 28 points. For older voters, Harris is winning women 63 to 28% and men by 47 to 45%. Reasons for this shift may include views on abortion, ACA, Obamacare, and Social Security, where Harris is viewed as protecting all three versus Trump viewed as restricting, removing or cutting funding. Further, comments from both Trump and Musk point to temporary hardship from their planned spending cuts and tariff plans. The economy is the primary issue for voters in this election. Separately, abortion rights are on the ballot in 10 states. Democrats have won every election with abortion rights on the ballot. Okay, so JP Morgan here talking about, looking at the markets and whatnot. They are predicting that they are talking about these topics as having a great effect on the desires of the electorate. And of course, the key one here for the economy is the planned spending cuts, the tax cuts that will add to the deficit, and then the tariff plans, which would be an issue for voters if they actually understood the economy. For many who don't understand the economy, they allow, Trump's going to be better on the economy. Whereas the people who know, like the economists, are like, nah. That ain't happening. So interestingly, we have the endorsement from the Economist magazine, which is a British magazine, but it's a kind of classical economic magazine, as in liberalism with a small L. So less regulation, more free market enterprise. That's kind of where the Economist sits. And their endorsement of Harris is huge, but it was also a really robust endorsement. And the editor-in-chief, it talks about the decision and how they came to that decision in this very interesting interview.
The Economist, which has formally issued an endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris for president. The Economist writes in part, quote, while some newspapers refused to back a presidential candidate this year, today the Economist is endorsing Kamala Harris. Tens of millions of Americans will vote for Mr. Trump next week. Some will be true believers, but many will take a calculated risk that in office his worst instincts would be constrained. We see that as recklessly complacent. By making Mr. Trump leader of the free world, Americans would be gambling with the economy, the rule of law, and international peace. Ms. Harris's shortcomings, by contrast, are ordinary, and none of them are disqualifying. If the Economist had a vote, we would cast it for her.
It's really robust language, as mentioned there, and it is spot on, which is that all of Ms. Harris's shortcomings are pretty ordinary. They are just like, it's okay, a bit of a, don't agree with that economic policy there. Don't think that's going to help the deficit too much, or that's not, those kind of normal, in every normal election, they would be what you'd be arguing about. But in terms of, in contrast to Trump, they're not disqualifying at all. These are just ordinary issues that we might take with her position on X, Y, and Z. With Trump, we have huge disqualifying issues with regard to wanting to round up the enemy within. Talking about rounding up the press, the free press, and because he has called them the enemy within as well, and that's with the National Guard or even Army. We're talking about censorship of the free press, talking about presidential immunity and being able to commit crimes and sacking all the people investigating him of doing these crimes, like Jack Smith, so on and so forth. These are like disqualifying issues, as well as being a felon, a convicted found liable for sexual abuse. And so on and so forth. All of these are like, that's a problem. Can't vote for him for that, and that. These are huge disqualifying issues. And I could go on and on and on, but you get the point. That is where The Economist is going.
Let's bring in editor-in-chief of The Economist, Zanny Minton-Beddoes. Zanny, it's great to have you back on the show. The Economist has been endorsing candidates since 1980. Was there any discussion about not endorsing at this moment in time? And why did The Economist make the pretty blistering collective editorial that it did against Donald Trump?
So great to join you again. No, there was never a question that we would not do an endorsement. We have done, as you said, we've done an endorsement every presidential election since 1980. We write endorsements for many other countries' elections too. And in the US, we've endorsed Republicans in the past and Democrats. We are non-partisan. We are really beholden only to our traditional English liberal values that we were founded like 180 years ago to champion: free markets, individual freedom, and so forth. And every week, as you know, we write editorials offering advice to political leaders around the world on policies. And it would be weird, therefore, for us to decide not to endorse a candidate. And so I had
I do like her, by the way. She's great. I'm not any kind of great classical economist in terms of your small L liberalism. I'm more of a mixed economy, free market, but with some strategic overview, which is kind of what we see even with the most free market economics that are held up as these wonderful free market examples, such as Singapore, which has these SOEs, the strategically plan their economies with the free market in mind. But often free marketeers say, look at Singapore, it's amazing. I'd advise reading Ha-Joon Chang's 23 things you don't know about capitalism or something. It's a really good book that looks at some of these supposedly, like Industrial Revolution. Britain was held up as like, this is the greatest example of free market capitalism. And it's like, we used industry protectionism and all these kind of things that involved strategic planning from the government that showed that it wasn't actually just pure free market capitalism. So I'm a bit more nuanced. I wouldn't necessarily agree with her economically, but I'd side more with her point of view than going completely the other direction. I would say that I like her a lot on things like the Ukraine war. Actually, The Economist earlier on in the war was really strong. I mean, Shashank Joshi from The Economist is fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. They used to have videos at the beginning of the war concerning the war completely from an economic point of view, but also from a general media point of view that were really very good. And yeah, I've got a lot of time for her.
No doubt that we were going to endorse. And every time we have a similar approach, which is quite different to US publications. We convene all of our journalists in a room and we have a long discussion. And I always ask somebody to make the best possible case for both candidates. And we did that this time. We did it a week ago because I was in the Middle East earlier this week. And we had a very long, detailed discussion about what people thought. And then I kind of framed the editorial. A colleague of mine wrote it, and it was a collective effort. And it's one that brings all of our journalists together. Ultimately, it's obviously my responsibility, but this has nothing to do with anybody outside our journalism. We're truly independent, and we believe that there's no contradiction between having a view and an opinion and being independent.
Zanny, I read the editorial, and it seems to be more a case against Donald Trump than it is a case for Kamala Harris. So make the case against Donald Trump, in particular the comparison you make with 2016 and how the world is different now and how the American guardrails against him are different now.
Yeah, Katie, you're absolutely right. This is really a leader about Donald Trump and the unacceptable risk that we think he poses to America and the world. And the audience that we had in mind when we wrote this was our many readers who are Republicans. We have Republicans and Democrat readers. And we didn't want this to be kind of a grand statement for the history books. We wanted to try and lay out to those readers that we have who are likely to vote for Donald Trump why we think that he poses a risk.
And she talks about these three different aspects that you just, in my opinion, you can't argue with. Like, this is, to me, the decision should be a no-brainer. And The Economist is just one of many media outlets that are espousing these kind of views.
There are really three sets of reasons. And these are people who I think will have seen in the first Trump term that actually there was a lot of bombast and drama, but the economy did pretty well, and he wasn't as catastrophic as people feared. So I think these are people who probably don't much like him as a person, don't see him as a role model for their kids, but do think that the risks around him may be wildly overblown. And we think they're wrong. And in three broad areas. One, what Donald Trump is promising to do with the economy is way more radical than 2016 and way more dangerous. His tariff policy, his promise to deport millions of undocumented migrants, his reckless tax policy, all of these things we think from just a straight economic perspective are much more dangerous than people realize. Secondly, as Richard Haas just laid out to you, the world is much more dangerous. In 2016, the world was a pretty complicated place, but it was nothing like what we have now, with 2 wars raging, with a sort of growing axis of evil, or whatever you want to call it, between Iran, North Korea, countries like that, Russia. This is a time when America needs its alliances. And actually, one of the great strengths of the Biden administration has been to rebuild alliances and relationships with...
I can't tell you how important that is, by the way. We could talk about Biden not being strong enough on Ukraine, but he has absolutely been at the forefront of the resurgence of NATO and of interaction with the EU, for example. He understands international alliances in a way that Trump doesn't. Trump, as I've said many times before, is a transactionalist on a very micro scale, and he looks at the international world in the same light. As I said before, Madeleine Albright, in her book Fascism, talks about this very eloquently, how Trump just doesn't understand the idea that you can have positive sum gain relationships with people, that everyone's, if someone else is doing well, it's necessarily at the expense of yourself. And therefore, if the flip side is, if you're doing well, it's at the expense of someone else. And that's how he views the international, because he thinks in terms of a business competitor, that everyone is a competitor rather than, getting together for your own mutual benefit, because you could do things together you couldn't do on your own. NATO, the EU are good examples of this. He doesn't understand that whole rubric, that you can have a positive sum gain. We both win out of this situation. If we form a collective alliance, security alliance, then the US doesn't have to do everything. They can use Australia and Japan in the Indo-Pacific to help them out with regard to China. The EU is incredibly important for global stability and European stability, and economic stability, so that they can be doing things in the US's best interest, but it's not always the US doing everything, so on and so forth. And that's what you get from working with people rather than against people. And he doesn't understand the notion of alliances well enough.
Countries around the world. And Donald Trump, if one thing we know about him is that he's unpredictable, the other is that he has a total contempt for alliances. So that's the second reason. And then the third reason is that we think he would be much more unconstrained. And there is a real risk that he threatens America's institutions. In 2016, there were a lot of grown-ups around him. This is a well-known argument, but there were grown-ups in the room. This time, we think it is much more likely that it will be kind of toadies, chancers. He will not have the serious grown-ups. And when you have...
So this is what the Harris campaign at the moment is calling, there will be no guardrails, that he'll get in. And what happened in 2016, as I've said before again, is that he accidentally won an election that he really wasn't expecting to win. And most analysts weren't expecting him to win. He is behind in the polls, etc., etc. As a result of not expecting to win and winning kind of accidentally, he didn't have a huge team that could take over the administration that he had put in place himself. He actually wasn't in a position to be able to do that because he was a political newcomer. So he was riding on the coattails, really, of the GOP. The GOP just put there many establishment people. He had people, Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and some of these more nefarious people. But in general, there were as Beddoes here says, adults in a room. So they were able to hold Trump back from his most extreme or unpredictable outbursts and desires. And they were the guardrails that stopped Trump doing crazy things. This time round, there's been 8 years, and people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, that's entirely the issue with this potential Trump administration, is that there are no guardrails from serious old school politicians and Republicans, and this is ideologically crazy people that even Trump himself doesn't really agree with. Like, if you sat him down in the cold light of day and explained that this policy means this, is like, what would you think is a good idea here? You probably wouldn't agree with the kind of Christian nationalism as espoused by the authors of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. But those people are now, they proliferate the entire campaign, and they are in place to take over the administration. And, they are the guardrails. In fact, but they're not guardrails, right? They are facilitators of a more extreme ideological political agenda. And that is what is worrying someone like, or an organization like The Economist, because they see that as being much more likely to upset the apple cart in terms of economic stability around the world. If he's going to start trade wars with China, and we have heard with the EU, he started slagging off the EU and saying they were worse than his enemies the other day. So he's taken a pop at the EU. The EU are now putting things in place in case there's a trade war with America. So they're thinking how to do X, Y, and Z and to fight back in terms of tariffs and exports and imports. This is just an absolute economic car crash waiting to happen. That's what she's talking about here.
The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who worked with him, his own chief of staff, calling him a fascist. When you have half his cabinet unwilling to support him, these are the kind of references that if you were hiring someone for a job, you would really think twice about hiring someone where you had those references of people who had worked closely with that person before. So
this is such a good point, by the way. It really is a powerful point. So we have, let's call into play this particular post. So this is an all warning signs blinking red plea to the American people from those who are in charge of keeping us safe. Don't let Donald Trump. So National Security Leaders for America said an updated endorsement. 1,043 national security leaders, including 10 cabinet and 11 service secretaries and 253 retired admirals and generals, 49 senior enlisted and 164 ambassadors proudly endorsed Kamala Harris for president. You can't get a more sort of powerful endorsement in terms of national security stability or international stability than that. This as well, this is incredible. I don't think people appreciate, says Chris Owicki, enough how utterly unprecedented this is, not to mention being as red a red flag as you can get. Imagine you were going for a job, right? And your prospective bosses wrote to sort of all the people that you work with, that you see in this picture, and only one of them endorsed you out of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. 1 out of 18. And the other 18 said basically, don't employ him or her. Don't employ this person. They're a fascist. They're a this, they're a that. They're a danger. You would never get that job. How the freaking hell is he even in with a chance of getting the job he is applying for when that many of the people who worked with him do not support him, do not endorse him? A quick look-see at which former Trump cabinet members are supporting him this go-round. Virtually none of them. That's such a good point from the editor here.
So add all of that together, and we think it's just an unacceptable risk. Look, I hope if he is elected president that we will be wrong and that those risks don't come to pass. But I think the tail risk of a Trump presidency, hard to quantify, but it's just too big. And so I think Kamala Harris, she may not be great. I'd be delighted if she was, but she may well be a mediocre president. But she does not pose that catastrophic risk.
Zanny, good morning. Let's talk about the economy for a moment. I'm looking at your recent striking cover that says the American economy is the envy of the world, with a picture of $100 bills rolled up and blasting off. You say America's economy is bigger and better than ever. We're going to get an unemployment number just a short time from now this morning that many expect from last month to be good for the American economy. We got a GDP number this week that was good for the American economy. Inflation is still too high for many people in this country. Goods cost too much, but that's headed in the right direction as well. So we've heard so much from Trump's side that America is a hellhole, that the country has been destroyed by Joe Biden and by association Kamala Harris. From your point of view, with your expertise and of all the writers at your magazine, What is the state of the American economy heading into Election Day?
Look, the American economy is in an extraordinarily strong place. That's why we put on our cover the envy of the world. It is in an extraordinarily good and strong place. One of the reasons people don't feel that is that there has been this period of very high inflation. And it takes a while for people that scars people, and people just remember how high prices are. And I understand that. But the truth is that relative to other countries, and indeed in absolute terms, the US economy is in a really, really strong place. But at the same time, I worry that that makes people complacent about what are the underlying strengths. It's not a God-given right that the US economy is a strong economy. It depends on having sensible policies as well as the US's natural strengths. A huge, energy endowment, a huge market, liquid capital markets. People want to come invest in America because America has the talent, America has a relatively light regulatory touch, and America is a stable place. And all of those things could be threatened. So I think it's just a mistake to think that you can take for granted American economic strength.
That's a really good point again, and she's absolutely right, and so is he, that the economy is in a phenomenally good place, and that is partly as a result, or largely as a result, of the reaction to COVID and the policies put in place and the bills enacted by the Biden administration, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, so on and so forth, the Infrastructure Act, things that Trump promised previously but never actually achieved. They did it straight away, the Biden administration, and they are now reaping the rewards. This is as Karl Kulinski from Secular Talk says, these are the effects of Trump's proposed tax cuts for the richest 5%, and other groups. And so for the richest 1%, they get a nice big tax cut. For the richest 5%, or the next 4%, they get another tax cut. And then you get average tax change by income group. It actually goes up for the next 15, 20, middle 20, second 20, and poorest 20%. And actually his tax regime would hurt middle Americans and the poorest, and would benefit the richest, exactly like those tax cuts in 2017 that added so much to the deficit. So again, this is just, why would you employ the guy that nobody endorses? Why would you employ the guy that's going to cost you more unless you're super rich? Why would you employ the guy that's going to repeal, as according to Mike Johnson, the CHIPS and Science Act? That would be one of the things they would look to repeal. That has caused so much economic growth. Why would you employ the guy that's going to put tariffs on right across the board on everything coming into the country that would cause inflation for the population? And why would you employ the guy that's going to forcibly evict 13 million people that would cause massive inflation? And by the way, those people have had children. Those children are American citizens, and they would be, those parents would be ripped away from their children. So when asked what would you do about them, the answer was we'd send them as well. Like, you'd basically be deporting American citizens. It's insane, but economically speaking, that's inflationary as well. So this is really, really challenging, and I just don't understand how you can sort of justify voting for this guy. Incredible. And you're getting these other sort of, it's not just the Economist, Tucson's largest paper, the Arizona Daily Star, throwing its weight behind Kamala Harris, taking a hard stance against Trump's vile, racist, sexist rhetoric. They're not mincing their words, calling this a no-brainer decision with the stakes at an all-time high. For them, it's clear Trump's divisive, dangerous approach versus Harris's vision for middle-class opportunity, healthcare, and climate action. The message: Arizona, it's time to stand with Harris, says Brian Allen there. And we have really powerful endorsement. Just talking about endorsements, not necessary to do the economy anymore, but this is Harrison Ford's endorsement, which I thought was really powerful.
Never really wanted to talk about it very much, but when dozens of former members of the Trump administration are sounding alarms, saying, for God's sake, don't do this again, you have to pay attention. They're telling us something important. These aren't soft people. They're governors, generals, standing up against the leader of the party they spent their lives advocating for. For many of them, this will be the first time they've ever voted for someone who doesn't have an R next to their name, because they know this really matters. The truth is this: Kamala Harris will protect your right to disagree with her about policies or ideas. And then, as we have done for centuries, been voting for 64 years.
So on and so forth. It goes on obviously longer than that. But I just think, yeah, it's another celebrity endorsing Harris, so what? But actually, I love the idea of she's protecting your right to disagree with her. You know, she has not an enemies list, a to-do list. And I think that's really important. I'm going to end this video because I'm only going to do it on kind of the economy and sort of endorsements and national security. I just think, again, if you've got all of these people saying don't vote for this person, don't vote for this person, all of those national security leaders, then I'd be like, yeah, probably not a good idea. Anyway, my mate sent me this. Over the history of our country, there have been 46 presidents. Of them, there have been a total, or concerning them, a total of 91 felony indictments. Here's a list showing how the 91 felony indictments are distributed amongst those 46 presidents. Ah, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 91. 45th president gets 91 indictments. Everyone else, 0. And that's the guy almost half the country think is an acceptable choice for president. It's pretty worrying. Anyway, let me know what you think. I think the Beddoes' opinion here was really well constructed. Actually, I'd love to play you that whole video and react to it all, because I think she goes on to talk in detail about how they came to their decision and etc. etc. And also saying, you know, I disagree with some of Harris's policies, but you know, it's not the end of the world type thing. So anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.